And Janine has let me know I need to be a little bit quicker, so I will do what I can to do that. My name is Dave Roland, and I am, as of just a couple of weeks ago, the new director of litigation for a brand new organization called the Freedom Center of Missouri. My wife and I have been thinking about the Freedom Center for a long time. One of the things that we recognize is there are a lot of fantastic groups in Missouri, but one of the things that we have lacked is a group that was going to be exclusively dedicated to research and litigation on constitutional issues in this state. And so that's why we decided to go ahead and found this group. So our goal is going to be out there and not just be talking about these issues, but to be actively taking them to the courts and trying to take advantage of some of these constitutional provisions that Ron was just talking about. One of the things that he noted and that I want to reiterate, the Missouri Constitution is a fantastically important document for those of us who are here in this room and those of us who live in this state. Unlike the United States Constitution, we can't exactly pick it up and carry it around with us all the time because the Constitution that we have right now is more than 70,000 words. It is unbelievably long. But the Bill of Rights itself that's built into the Missouri Constitution is much more manageable. And that's where the Freedom Center is primarily going to focus. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about this idea of economic liberty, because this is going to be one of the cornerstones of what we do. Another way to think about the idea of economic liberty is to think about the right to earn a living. One of the things that Ron shared with you in his presentation, he talked about the founder's conception of property, and it was very much linked to this idea that people had a right to earn a living for themselves in a harmless profession. Early court cases for the first 150 years of the United States dealt with this idea, and they all agreed that there is a foundational constitutional right to earn a living. And when the Missouri Constitution was being shaped, they folded into its provisions, as Ron pointed out, not only the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but this extra provision that says you have the right to the enjoyment of the gains of their own industry. Part of the reason that we have this, we've talked about, the what. So let's talk a little bit about the why. One of the things that was recognized immediately after the Civil War was that the former slave states were imposing new legal regimes designed to prevent the newly freed slaves from earning a living. They would do it by blocking access to professions. They would say, you have to get government permission before you can engage in a certain profession. They would limit the wages that you could earn. They would impose all sorts of other restrictions on people's ability to earn a living. And as Ron pointed out, if you can control how someone earns a living, you control every aspect of their lives. In Missouri, they recognized the challenge that this posed, and they said, we're not going to have that here. We want to make sure that people in this state never have to depend on their government for the right to go out and use their skills and their knowledge to make a living for themselves and their family. And that's why we have this constitutional provision. Unfortunately, we've gotten away from that hard and fast stand. As you are well aware, now a great many jobs in our country, in our state, you have to first get the government's permission before you can perform those jobs. If you look back 120 years ago, only about 3% of the American population had to get the government's permission, and that was doctors, lawyers, and accountants. Now, 1 in 3 of us has to get government's permission before they can go out and earn a living in their chosen profession. 1 in 3. How did we get here? Why did anyone think this was a good idea? That you should have to get the government's permission before you could go and do a job, before someone could hire you to do a job? Well, one of the reasons that people say is, well, we want to protect uninformed consumers. We want to make sure that they're not getting taken in by fly-by-night operations. Another argument in favor of licensing is we want to ensure that the people who are doing these jobs are competent. We want to make sure that they have a minimal level of training and that they're going to be good at the work that they're doing. And the third thing that they raise as a reason for this is we want to be able to discipline bad actors. If someone acts improperly or bilks somebody out of services, then we want to be able to punish them. Well, the thing is none of these arguments actually make sense when you look at what's happened. In fact, the regulatory boards that govern all these different professions, and in Missouri, we're looking at roughly 4 dozen different professions that are licensed and governed by a regulatory board. They're almost all made up of the people who are already within that industry. Have you heard the phrase, inmates running the asylum? That's exactly what happens. So if you have a panel of doctors overseeing the medical profession, they're going to create laws that are good for doctors. If you have lawyers overseeing the legal profession, they're going to make rules that are good for lawyers. And this is the same way that it functions for almost every board in this state. You have inmates running the asylum, and unfortunately, one of the most powerful tools that they have is to put up regulatory barriers to block people from competing with them. Now, one of the things that happens when you erect these sorts of regulatory barriers, when you make it much more difficult for people to get into a profession, is the people who are already in there automatically get to charge, studies show, about 14 to 18% more for the services that they provide. It's almost a given. And so what you've seen for the last several decades is frequently an industry group will go to the legislature and they'll say, "Ooh, we need to be regulated. We need to be regulated." Well, why do they want to be regulated? So that they can get this immediate 14 to 18% markup. It's great for their bottom line, terrible for consumers, terrible for ordinary people who want to be able to provide similar services that are completely harmless. One of the other things that studies have shown is that for all of the talk about how licensing is necessary to raise the standards of a profession, it is almost unheard of for the service provided in these industries to actually improve after a regulatory scheme has been introduced. Almost every study, and not every study, but almost every study, has shown that the quality of service, as judged by the consumers, has either stayed the same or it's dropped after you introduce a licensing scheme. Another thing is that we already have mechanisms in place to hold people accountable for bad service. Number one is the market. If someone provides bad service, then you're not going to go back to them. And in all likelihood, you're going to start telling your friends, I went to this person to receive this service and they were terrible. And word gets around. Negative publicity is a powerful, powerful force. And especially now that we have the internet as a tool, we have a greater ability than we have ever had in human history to convey this sort of information among consumers. And so we have a very powerful regulatory mechanism that is completely independent of government boards and agencies. Another thing that's important to point out, I think, especially in an economy like we're dealing with right now, is that we talked about how a licensing scheme allows the people providing services to charge an additional 14 to 18%. Well, that's terrible for consumers. If you're dealing with people who are already have limited means, then it's a terrible idea to force them to pay more for services. Every dollar that they spend on those services is a dollar that they can't spend on something else that they need. And so one of two things happens. Either they have to go without the services altogether and they realize the negative impacts of that, or they might try and do those services themselves. One of the studies that's been done talked about licensing of electricians. And normally people would say, oh, this is a great thing. We want to make sure that anyone doing wiring in a house or a building is going to be very well trained. Well, unfortunately, one of the things that's shown is people would, instead of paying the additional rates for licensed electricians to come in and do their homes, they would try and do it themselves, and you saw the number of electrocutions shoot up in these places that impose new regulatory regimes. Unintended consequences come about when you have these sorts of regulations imposed. And then also a very important point, regulatory boards are hostile to innovation and entrepreneurship. When you have a regulatory board, their interest is in maintaining the status quo, whatever the status quo is. And so if you have someone who comes up with a new business model, the people interested in the status quo will see that as a threat, because they may not be flexible enough to keep up with this new challenger in their business model. And they may see their bottom line start to suffer if too many people are coming up with new ideas. And so there's a fantastic movie that I highly recommend to everybody. It's called Garbage Warrior. And this movie follows the story of an architect out in New Mexico. Kind of a kooky guy. He's a left-wing granola hippie type, and he had this idea for building houses out of post-consumer waste. So he's getting old tires and beer cans and things like that. He's building houses out of them. He calls them earth ships. Sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? The thing is, they're completely structurally sound. And they're incredibly energy efficient. And the architects in New Mexico saw what he was doing and said, oh, well, we can't have this. And so they actually revoked his license in New Mexico. Now, the thing is, they did this right before the Indonesian tsunami and Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And so when he got his license revoked in New Mexico, he went to Indonesia and he went to Louisiana and started building these houses and got international accolades for the work that he was doing. He was internationally celebrated, and he couldn't do his job in his home state. And so the movie follows him as he goes to the New Mexico legislature and tries to persuade them to allow him to introduce these new ideas into the way that architecture is done in the state. And I won't tell you how it comes out, but it's a fascinating look at the way that occupational licensing can derail innovation and improvement in the way that we do things in the United States. So unfortunately, what we've seen where the government gets a taste for imposing restrictions on who can do what job, you see completely absurd things pop up. This is just a short list of some of the restrictions that we've seen on professional activity. We've seen florists be told that they're not allowed to arrange and sell flowers unless they get a license. And who judges whether they get the license? The people who are already in the profession. We've seen street performers. I myself was denied a license to perform on the street in the city of Baltimore, Maryland. Why? I don't know. I think they just didn't like. I kind of used my audition to rail against the whole licensing process. I think they took exception to that. But in many cities, and I mean, it's unusual how many cities, you actually have to get a license to pick up a guitar and put out your case and accept money on the streets. It's unthinkable. Casket salespeople. I don't know if you're aware. I hope that you're not familiar with the funeral industry, but funerals can be crazy expensive, and part of the expense of it is that in most states, you're not allowed to sell caskets unless you're a licensed funeral director. And because there's this monopoly on selling caskets, funeral directors routinely mark up the price of caskets by 3 and 4 times. And so, in fact, when I was with the Institute for Justice in D.C., one of our cases dealt with a pastor of a small, low economic class church in Chattanooga who just wanted to provide a way for his flock to have cheaper funeral services. And the state was cracking down on him because he hadn't embalmed 25 dead bodies like the law required. And that case turned into the first one in decades where a United States Circuit Court drew a line and said, for heaven's sakes, enough is enough. You can only regulate people so far. You can only restrict economic liberty so much. But unfortunately, a couple of years later, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Oklahoma, with almost exactly the same facts, went the other direction and said, for all the things that the Constitution protects, it does not protect